President Reagan announces South Africa sanctions and draws fire from Bishop Tutu. Two NBC journalists die covering a failed coup in Thailand, and a New York City flare-up over kids and AIDS in school.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. President Reagan tonight is under attack from both sides of the South Africa dispute for steps that he took today. The president, who has always said that he opposes economic sanctions against South Africa, issued an executive order that amounts to limited sanctions. The president banned computer sales to South African agencies that are involved in the enforcement of apartheid, the separation of the races. He also banned the sale of nuclear technology. He banned bank loans unless they help blacks as well as whites. And the president proposed a possible ban on the sale of Krugerrands, South Africa's popular gold coins. The president took this action as Congress was preparing to pass its own tougher sanctions against South Africa. Chris Wallace at the White House tonight. This is a real about-face for the president, isn't it?
Well, Tom, officials here deny any flip-flop in basic policy toward South Africa. But they acknowledge that faced with a changing situation, the president did change his tactics.
After years of pushing constructive engagement, trying to influence South Africa through dialogue, not pressure, Mr. Reagan today approved limited sanctions.
I am signing today an executive order that will put in place a set of measures designed and aimed against the machinery of apartheid without indiscriminately punishing the people who are victims of that system.
Aides say the big difference from the congressional bill is that the president rejected a call for broad sanctions in 12 months if there's no progress. But they admit the ban on Krugerrand imports would affect the South African economy in just the way Mr. Reagan has opposed. The president said U.S. policy should now be called active constructive engagement.
It is persuasion, but also indicating that the American people can get impatient with this.
Impatience with South Africa was the reason for the president's switch. Administration officials realized Congress would pass sanctions even over a Reagan veto and wanted to avoid an embarrassing defeat. Critics called today's action everything from public relations to a sellout.
President Reagan's proposals announced today are a desperate attempt to rescue a failed policy and block action by the Senate.
I profoundly regret President Reagan's decision to switch rather than fight on the issue of sanctions against South Africa.
Administration officials note that U.S. influence over South Africa is limited. In fact, some of today's sanctions, such as the computer ban, are already in effect. So the real story today may be something else: how much influence Congress has over the Reagan foreign policy. Tom?
Thanks, Chris. And on Capitol Hill tonight, John Dancy, where Congress is feeling much more muscular today. John, it's forced the president's hand.
Tom, Congress really won this battle because it forced the president to invoke sanctions, something which he said he would not do.
Oh, yes, I think so.
By the time he arrived at the Capitol this morning, Democratic leader Robert Byrd knew Congress had forced the president to compromise.
The president and the administration attempted to avoid a showdown on this issue. They have seen the signals.
To avoid a showdown with Congress, the president sent Secretary of State Schultz to Capitol Hill. His message to the Senate leaders: put off a vote. Give the president's plan a chance. Under pressure from the president, Schultz, and Majority Leader Dole, Senate Republicans agreed to effectively put off action on the congressional sanctions and leave the president's executive order as the only U.S. statement on apartheid. Proponents of tougher sanctions were outraged.
The executive order is an act of political expediency to avert defeat in the United States Senate.
Kennedy of Massachusetts said the president's order is weaker than the legislation would have been and sends the wrong signal to the leaders of South Africa.
And the message would be that they have more time, that they don't really have to address the issue of apartheid.
But conservative Republican Jesse Helms, who filibustered against the tougher sanctions in the Senate bill, supports the president's executive action.
It clears the deck so that he can hope that the Senate will spend its time on issues of real concern and of real importance to the American people, instead of spinning its wheels on a lot of conversation about an irrelevant issue, apartheid, which nobody favors.
With the exception of Helms and a few other conservatives, Congress does not really like the sanctions as written by the president. It says they aren't tough enough, but Congress probably will accept them. Tom?
Thanks, John. In South Africa, President P.W. Botha blamed Congress for pressuring President Reagan. He said the president's actions were less harmful than what Congress has in mind, But Botha said they were nonetheless regrettable, a negative step. John Cochran in South Africa tells us that black leaders, however, were much tougher on President Reagan.
Bishop Desmond Tutu got word of President Reagan's decision not long after his oldest son, Trevor, came home with a jailhouse haircut after 2 weeks in detention, held without charge under emergency regulations. Maybe that is why Trevor's father was so angry, calling President Reagan's actions today meaningless and calling Mr. Reagan a crypto-racist.
He doesn't care two beans about black people in South Africa. I don't think he cares at all. And that is why I call him a crypto-racist. I think I should call him a racist, pure and simple.
White businessmen took President Reagan's decision calmly. The head of the South African Chamber of Commerce, Raymond Parsons.
The impact on the private sector in South Africa will be minimal.
Banning the sale of Krugerrands will hurt South Africa, but not much. Americans aren't the only ones in the market for gold coins. How about the ban on computer sales and nuclear technology? Again, it will hurt, but not much. Restricting bank loans would hurt. South Africa is in the middle of an economic recession and a financial crisis. South Africa needs foreign credit. What South Africans already know is that gasoline prices went up 10 cents a gallon today. Not because of President Reagan, but because the South African currency has dropped to record lows, largely the result of American banks calling in loans here, creating the worldwide impression that South Africa is no longer a safe investment. Political decisions made in Washington get the headlines, but the South African economy is hemorrhaging from decisions made in the boardrooms of New York. John Cochran, NBC News, Johannesburg.
Also coming up here tonight, Fred Francis has a special segment report on the command and control of America's nuclear defenses. How safe are they from sabotage? And George Lewis looks at the fine art of hitting a baseball. There's more to it than just swinging. Former military leaders of Thailand sent a column of tanks into Bangkok today trying to overthrow the civilian government there. But the attempted coup ended in failure and the arrest of 3 of its leaders. The fighting, however, left 4 people dead, among them 2 men covering the story for NBC News. Bureau Chief and cameraman Neil Davis and soundman Bill Latch. Lloyd Dobbins reports tonight they were gunned down without warning.
To residents of Bangkok, the tanks on the street this morning meant only one thing, another attempted coup. Neil Davis and Bill Latch were taking pictures of rebel tanks when they suddenly and without warning opened fire. Close by, another crew taped the same sequence as the tank turret turned toward Davis and Latch, firing 50 and 30 caliber machine guns and a 75 millimeter cannon. Help! Help! Latch, wounded, waved a white handkerchief. Davis, his camera still running, collapsed in front of his own lens. With the tank still firing, the other cameraman pulled Davis away while Latch, shot through the legs, crawled behind him.
Where's Neil? Right there.
Doctors say Davis, in all probability, was already dead. Latch died in the hospital 6 hours later. The coup failed. Lloyd Dobbins, NBC News, Bangkok.
Bill Latch had worked for NBC since 1979, Neil Davis since 1975. The president of NBC News, Larry Grossman, called their deaths great tragedies for all of us. Davis was the last Western newsman to leave Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War. His colleague, Don Oliver, remembers him as a man who never ran from danger.
Neil Davis was a talented writer, reporter, and cameraman whose judgment and courage had made him a legend among those who covered the wars in Southeast Asia. He was almost killed in the first battle he ever reported, in Vietnam in 1964. Twice during the 11 years he covered the wars in Vietnam and Cambodia, he was badly wounded. These are Neil Davis pictures. They demonstrate far better than words his bravery and devotion to his profession.
I wanted to show all those things, and the only way to show them was being in the front line, the real front line.
In 1979, Neil was the subject of a documentary done by a television network from his native Australia and shown around the world.
I was never afraid of being killed, because that's that. I mean, you're done. I didn't want to be badly wounded. I'd seen many badly wounded people. I didn't want a load of shrapnel in my guts, for instance, and die a painful death on the battlefield.
In 1975, Neil volunteered to stay in Vietnam while other Western journalists were being evacuated. He took these historic pictures of the Viet Cong tanks smashing through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon.
I said in Vietnamese, Chào mừng Saigon đồng chí, welcome to Saigon.
After 1975, Neil was NBC's bureau chief, correspondent, and cameraman in Bangkok, Thailand. In reality, he spent most of his life on the road, covering disasters, wars, and rebellions in places like India, Angola, and the Philippines. Those of us who knew him wish he'd been sent out of town yesterday. Neil Davis was 52.
We were not the only ones who thought that Neil Davis was special. When word of his death began to get around today, other journalists who had worked with him in Southeast Asia began to call in. They all referred to Neil Davis as a legend in that part of the world, someone who seemed to know everyone on every side of the many conflicts there. When the wars in Southeast Asia appeared here on television, they had a nice, safe, electronic distance to them. But Neil Davis was always in the middle of the real fighting, which makes what happened to him today all the more ironic and outrageous, that he was killed in a tin horn uprising. On special segment tonight, America's nuclear command and control system. That's the heart of our ability to respond to a nuclear attack. This question, could it be destroyed by sabotage? Fred Francis reports the system has some glaring weaknesses, and they are already well known to the Soviet Union.
Young lieutenants isolated in North Dakota, scanning the northern skies. The scope will tell Mary Kay Rothermich and Frank Alexa where and when Soviet warheads will strike. In minutes, their assessment of the Soviet attack must reach the president. But the giant radar rising from Midwestern wheat fields that the president and all of us rely upon could easily be blinded. It could be taken out by Soviet agents or commandos who could quickly eliminate these men from Apartment Guards Incorporated. Their handguns the only protection for a radar which watches our northern frontier. An investigation by NBC News shows that other radars, satellite control points, ground terminals, and command centers could also be destroyed quite easily by Soviet sabotage. The first weak link comes after our warning satellites spot a Soviet missile launch. As those missiles head for American targets, the satellite sends that warning to Earth. That's where the vulnerability begins. The warning message is first sent here to the Australian outback, to one of America's most secret satellite ground stations. The first warning of Soviet attack could be interrupted by sabotage here. The Soviets know where it is and how to penetrate it. In fact, for $330, anyone can buy this from the Department of Interior, a huge NASA satellite photo which shows the critical installation and its security zone. If the warning signal gets out of Australia, it is sent by satellite relay across the Pacific before dividing into two routes at Camp Roberts, California, a critical ground station within easy rocket range of the base perimeter. In one routing, the signal goes underground to this AT&T switching station in nearby San Luis Obispo. It is not guarded. The warning of a Soviet attack then enters the nation's telephone system, the same one we all use for transmission to military commanders and the White House. The general who oversees the system says sabotage is a concern, but not simple to carry out.
There are a lot of uncertainties in the process of doing that sort of thing, and things don't always happen as neatly as they do on Mission Impossible.
General Harries has confidence in the backup system, but it is as exposed as the primary route. At the same time the warning is sent by satellite, it also leaves Australia by underwater cable. It can be cut easily by any diver in its 6,000-mile path across the Pacific. The cable makes landfall at two locations on the west coast. At one, it comes underneath these logs into the Canadian lumber town of Port Alberni.
You know, it would be a comparatively simple matter, let's face it, to blow it up.
No matter what routing the early warning signal takes, it ends up here at Buckley Air National Guard Base on the edge of Denver's suburban sprawl. From here, it's sent to the entire defense network. Again, vulnerability. Those two strands of barbed wire and a few guards inside, that's the protection. The man at the Pentagon charged with improving the system says Buckley's responsibility will be spread out to other bases next year. As for sabotage,
I think attack against an Earth terminal is a very severe situation, and that in itself would be warning that to go to look somewhere else if something was happening.
looking somewhere else for Soviet attack means using photo reconnaissance and eavesdropping spy satellites. This is mission control for those satellites. Sunnyvale Air Force Station, California, hard by 2 freeways. Perhaps the most important U.S. military base in the world. Take out those dishes and most of the eyes and ears of this other warning system are lost. And the Soviets do know about Sunnyvale and all the other warning facilities. They're discussed in hundreds of publications and at open Senate hearings like this one. And Soviet military attachés, like the man in the gray suit, Mikhail Berdenikov, are on hand taking notes and recording everything.
Do you usually attend the sessions? Certainly, if they're open and if everything.
In spite of everything, the Pentagon believes the system is secure.
It's better now than any time I've ever been in it. The threat is more severe now than at any time.
The threat is why hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent to patch up the warning system which the administration inherited. Millions more are budgeted for this year, all to buy the president time to strike back. Fred Francis, NBC News, the Pentagon.
Tomorrow, part 2 of this report, protecting the president after a first strike. There was a new fear in the classroom on this first day of school in New York City, the fear of AIDS. Officials have allowed a 7-year-old AIDS victim to attend class, saying the second grader is not a threat to other children. But the parents are not so sure, and because of that fear, Jennifer McLogan reports tonight that 10,000 students stayed away.
In New York's largest school district, Queens, thousands of parents refuse to allow their children to enter school, afraid they might be in class with a child who has AIDS.
No one's sure of exactly what's going on with this disease, and I don't want to take chances with my children. I love them too much. We love our children. We want them in school when it's safe.
Before classes started today, a specially appointed panel ruled that 3 New York children with AIDS would not be allowed to attend school, but determined 1 second grader was well enough to go. Officials would not reveal who the child was or which school the child would attend.
No.
New York's mayor said parents should stop frightening their children with talk about AIDS.
After that child has been examined.
I am not trying.
Today, some parents went to court demanding that AIDS children be barred from public schools. The request was denied, but other suits have been filed in federal court.
Boycotting is simply going to deprive their children of an education.
This mother of one AIDS victim says she has been harassed and says she is afraid of being further identified. She spent the last week trying to explain to her 5-year-old daughter why she can't go to school.
Would you like to go to school?
You have to talk. She can't say yes. Yes.
Some parents say even though they have great sympathy for children with AIDS, they will continue to keep their children out of school. Jennifer McLogan, NBC News, New York.
On Wall Street today, stocks closed slightly higher in moderate trading.
Going downtown.
2 balls, 2 strikes.
Even great hitters like Pete Rose failed to make a hit 7 out of 10 times, reinforcing the argument of those who contend that hitting is the most difficult feat in sports. Bioengineer Terry Bayhill has made a study of hitting. In his lab, he can simulate the flight of baseballs and track the reflexes of his subjects. Dr. Bayhill points out that once it has left the pitcher's hand, a ball traveling at 90 miles an hour takes less than half a second to reach the batter. The decision to swing or duck out of the way of the ball must be made in about 13 1/100ths of a second. Dr. Bayhill says great players seem to have almost a sixth sense about the behavior of the baseball.
He looks at the way it starts to move in the beginning, and he has to then make his projections of where it's going to be when it crosses the plate.
And he has to make that complicated series of projections in less than half a second, which makes the 4,191 hits of Pete Rose seem all that more remarkable. George Lewis, NBC News.
I have a friend who says that If everyone could hit a major league curveball, you wouldn't have so many guys selling used cars these days. That's Nightly News for Monday. I'm Tom Brokaw. I'll see you tomorrow night.